All right, good afternoon again. This is Ben Zong with the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. With me today is Andrew Martinez with the California Resources Board and my colleague David Park, our Industry Affairs Director with the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. Here at the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership, we are a collaboration of industry and government organizations with a little bit over 70 members. Our main objective is to bring together organizations to work on expanding the market for hydrogen fuel cell technology and to help create a cleaner future. If your organization is interested in joining, please contact us and we can discuss how we can work together to move hydrogen fuel cell technology forward. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are muted. However, we will have a Q&A session at the end. And so please use the GoToWebinar questions feature to ask questions. Also, the webinar is being recorded. The recording as well as the presentation slides will be posted on the Fuel Cell Partnership website later next week. Once it is posted, we will send an email with information on where those links are located on our website. And so with that, before I hand off to Andrew, David, if you want to say a few words.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here introducing Andrew Martinez. Just a little bit of background on the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. We were founded by the California Air Resources Board in 2000. When we were founded, we were called the California Fuel Cell Partnership, and we have just in the last month shifted our organization from a California focus to a national focus, and we are now called the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership. But that is not to say that we are leaving California behind. California very much is our focus because it is the only hydrogen economy in the country and one of the only hydrogen economies in the world. And so I'm pleased to present or to introduce to you Andrew Martinez with the California Air Resources Board. He is the hydrogen program expert and current interim manager of the light duty zero emission infrastructure program. In this role, he has spent the past several years analyzing the development of the light duty hydrogen fueling network in California, modeling for future development and supporting hydrogen station incentive programs. Andrew's work also assesses the development and the deployment of fuel cell electric vehicles. As the interim manager, Andrew also oversees ARB's efforts related to light-duty battery electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Andrew's past experience includes air quality modeling and research on high-temperature solid oxide fuel cells, including their application to freight rail locomotives. Andrew holds a PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of California, Irvine. And so, without further ado, take it away, Dr. Martinez.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar. And today, what we're really going to do is cover the material found in our latest annual evaluation of fuel cell electric vehicle deployment and hydrogen fuel station network development. As I'm sure at least some of you know, since this is now I believe our 8th or 9th edition of this report, this annual evaluation comes out of what's known as AB 8 or Assembly Bill 8, which was signed by Governor Brown in 2013. As some of you all probably know as well, California has been for several years putting funds towards the co-development or the co-funding and development of a hydrogen fueling station network across the state of California, and that AB8 is really what started that off in our current form and getting us into actual retail stations where the public can actually fuel pretty easily and pretty much like they do with their normal gasoline fueling experience. AB8 allocates up to $20 million annually to the California Energy Commission to utilize toward the development of that hydrogen infrastructure. And as part of the overall package within AB8, it also requires annual reporting, essentially on the progress and on the needs for where the future development needs to go. So CARB's role in this process is to provide advice and recommendations to the Energy Commission for where the hydrogen fueling station networks need to go, what their capacities need to be, what the technical specifications and capabilities need to be, etc. And there are certain pieces that are outlined in AB8 that must be in part of every annual evaluation that CARB publishes. So each year we go through and we look at current and projected fuel cell vehicle fleets numbers and where they may be, the projections for where they may be located. We do the same for stations. So where do we know all the stations that are built and open today? Where are all the known projects that are under development, and where might there be projects to be built in the future? We look at the concepts of what are called coverage and capacity. So coverage being, how many stations are near me? How far is it to get to a station from my neighborhood, from your neighborhood, from all the different communities around California, and how many different options do you have? Capacity, of course, is then how big are these stations? How many vehicles can they fuel in each day? And how do those networks and how do the network metrics for both coverage and capacity align with where we see the market for fuel cell electric vehicles? So we do these assessments to recommend where the next stations should be targeted. That has come through various means in the past Energy Commission solicitations that fund stations. It has meant at times that it's very prescriptive. At other times, it hasn't been so much prescriptive, so much as it is kind of recommendations or trying to guide station developers to the preferred locations. In addition, like I said, we do recommend the funding levels and the technical specifications. So what protocols, fueling protocols for safety, reliability, and comfort for the driving public to use the stations. I will quickly mention that there is also a second report that's due every single year as well. This is a joint agency staff report that is published by the Energy Commission. We do help the Energy Commission write this report, write certain parts of it, and it does have some similar items. It does provide a end of the year update on, where are we with vehicles, where are we with stations, but it does more of an assessment of kind of the performance of the program and of the stations themselves. So it does talk a bit more about the utilization trends, how much of the station capacity is being used in different regions across the state. How much is it costing to build the stations? How long is it taking to build the stations? And what are the projections for when we will get to certain targets? So this year's joint agency staff report is actually currently under development. You can expect to see it published by the Energy Commission by the end of the year. They're typically published in December of each year. So be on the lookout for that report for some additional information beyond what we'll be talking about today. So for today, we are going to concentrate though on the annual evaluation. We'll talk about the major findings, go over some select details of the analysis that could be interesting to those of you on the webinar today. Discuss a little bit about how this ties to station funding, especially since there has been a recent announcement, and then briefly cover the conclusions and recommendations that we make in this year's annual report. For those of you who have read these reports, you will see that the structure of today's presentation is pretty familiar. We start off every report in the executive summary with a handful of findings, and so we'll dive into those first. Each year, our first finding is usually about the status of the open station network. So at the time that we wrote this report and it was published or finalized in June, California's hydrogen fueling network had grown to 60 stations, 56 of which were what are considered open retail and therefore available for customer fueling. Now, the 4-station difference is because there are 4 stations that have been open retail, so available to fueling customers to just drive up to and fuel their vehicles, but they have been closed for a period of more than 30 days because they have had some sort of issue at the location. Each one of those 4 stations has had its own issue and had its own timeline. At the moment, we do not know the expected timeline for those stations to reopen, but they are expected at some point to come back to the network. Since we actually published this report, there have been 2 additional stations, one in Seal Beach and one in Burbank, that have opened as well. So today, we would actually count 62 open retail stations. And as I mentioned, an open retail station is just like your gasoline station. It's a station where you can just drive up with your fuel cell vehicle, swipe your card, and get a full fill and drive away happy. The map on the right shows the location of all the open stations, all 60 of them at the time that we wrote the report. The circles are stations that have been open and that we had already reported on in prior years of this analysis, and the diamonds are the new stations. So you can see that our network really is primarily focused around the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, both in the north and the south parts of the Bay, Los Angeles area, Orange County, and a little bit in Sacramento. We do have an additional station near San Diego, and we have a few stations that are considered destination or connector stations, so Truckee, Coalinga, and Santa Barbara. We do anticipate that as the network builds out, some of these connector stations might actually be markets of their own that would have multiple stations as well. And you can see that in the past year since this report, the stations that had opened up are all in Orange County, around Los Angeles County, and in the south portion of the San Francisco Bay Area around San Jose and in Cupertino. So that was where all the station development progress so far in the year had occurred. Now, 60 stations is not the full universe of the known locations. Right now, CARB and the Energy Commission are tracking a total of 176 total station projects from a combination of public and private funding efforts. So this includes all the stations that have received or been allotted co-funding by the Energy Commission, as well as a few announcements from private entities like First Element and Iwatani for stations that they are building fully with private funds. Some of those stations are considered match funding under the Energy Commission's grant solicitation programs, but they're not receiving public dollars. The chart on the right shows a status, again, in June, of all those 176 stations. And as you can see, there's actually a large chunk of them, 66 stations, that are future unknown locations. And that's because these are stations that have committed funding, co-funding from the Energy Commission, but they are not required yet to have their address known. So as some station developers have been funded for multi-year grant funds, and as they build out pieces of their network, they then propose the next piece of their network through the next several years. So we are still waiting to see where those 66 locations will come, but the funding is already committed to them. Our second finding concerns the pace of development of the hydrogen fueling station network. This has been notoriously difficult to project and to make predictions on, but every year we provide an update and we compare it to what we had projected in the prior year. So station development will be slower in 2022 than previously projected, but station developer projections are relatively unchanged for 2023 and later years. Now, this was, again, also at the time that we wrote this report. So in the figure on the right, you can see the dashed lines are our analysis, our projection from based on what we were hearing from station developers in last year's report. The solid line is what we are projecting now this year. And you can see that there's clearly been a slowdown in 2021 and 2022. We understand this to be lingering effects from the COVID-19 pandemic. There's still been some supply chain issues that, of course, linger. But in addition, we do also hear that there remains some local permitting challenges as well, which has, traditionally been an obstacle to some of the station developments throughout California's experienced so far. However, the station developers were telling us that they intended to pretty much get back on track by 2023. There would be a small gap from the prior projection, as you can see, 98 versus 104 in our prior projection, but it would be mostly making up the pace. At the time that we published this report, again, we had 56 open retail, 4 temporarily non-operational. Station developers had indicated that they thought we could get to 79 total stations open by the end of the year. However, in looking at other data that we have available at CARB, particularly through some of our station testing reservations, we perform station testing to make sure they're safe, following the protocols expected before they can open up. CARB staff estimated that approximately half of those would actually be open by the end of the year. So we're talking about somewhere between 69 and 79 total stations open by the end of the year. That had been our projection back in June. As I've mentioned already, we've had only 2 of those 10 to 19 stations open up so far, but we do know there are at least a handful more that are expecting to open by the end of the year and are working diligently to get there. As with a lot of things when it comes to construction, sometimes there's a lot that you just simply cannot account for or can't predict, even when making short-term projections for timelines. So we will see if we'll be able to meet even the 10 station estimate by the end of the year and get to 69 stations before the close of the year. But at the time that we wrote this report, this was our latest information. Our third finding is related to station targets, so broader targets for the overall network. Assembly Bill 8, when it was passed, set a minimum target of 100 hydrogen fueling stations by the end of the program. So more than 100 stations have obviously been funded. There are 176 total projects that are underway. Last year, we had actually projected, based on the information we had from the station developers, that we might actually have the 100th open retail station, open its doors for fueling by the end of 2023. With revised schedules, we think we'll be just short of that. Our projection here is, as you can see, 98 stations in 2023, and the 100th station will likely open in 2024. Now, again, as we've seen, this is going to require making sure that the station development projections stay on track, and that we can for future stations, move through some of the phases that have been challenges for some of these stations a lot faster than we have seen so far. In addition, Governor Brown's Executive Order B4818, so an executive order passed in 2018, established a further target of 200 hydrogen fueling stations by 2025. So the Energy Commission, as I had mentioned, through all of its AB8 funds and through and then in addition to the privately funded stations, would get us to 176 hydrogen fueling stations. In 2021, the California state budget included a large package for ZEVs, for zero emission vehicles, that included portions for infrastructure. Some of that money, $27 million, was then identified by the Energy Commission to fill the gap to 200 stations through a new station solicitation. So we expect that this new solicitation will get us at least to the 200 station target funded by 2025. However, as you can see from this figure, we likely are not going to have 200 stations open, even for the 176 stations that we have funded right now. All of those will not be open until 2026 at the earliest. So it will be later in this decade that we will be hitting the 200 station mark, unless there is some large acceleration of station development times that appears over the next few years. I'll discuss a little bit more about that solicitation in a few more slides, so hold on to that thought. Our next finding concerns the coverage of the network with respect to what are known as disadvantaged communities. So updated coverage analyses continue to demonstrate that California's expanding hydrogen fueling network is conveniently located for some disadvantaged communities, though gaps remain in many communities across the state. So a disadvantaged community is actually well defined by a totally separate analysis that has been completed by CARB and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. Disadvantaged communities are communities that have historically and currently face a disproportionate environmental burden and that is also impacted by other socioeconomic factors. There are several disadvantaged communities identified throughout the state, and a lot of the funding efforts that are currently underway for zero-emission vehicle infrastructure, for general environmental improvement, et cetera, are working hard to ensure that those communities do not continue to be left behind and do not continue to face disproportionate burdens into the future. So we analyze where the stations in the network are placed with respect to these communities. And we find that a lot of the stations, actually the majority of the stations, 102 of the 110 stations, are within what we consider to be the limits of coverage, within 15 minutes of a station. There's still a large majority of them that are within the most convenient, or within the more convenient metric of a 6-minute drive. And a 6-minute drive has been shown by prior work to be similar to the convenience provided by today's gasoline station network in many urban areas. So we can see that a lot of the stations are actually located either directly within a disadvantaged community or within a short drive of a disadvantaged community. And if those residents have a fuel cell vehicle, they would be able to pretty easily integrate the vehicle into their daily lives. However, we went a little bit further this year than we have in prior years, and we analyzed the coverage of all the 110 known hydrogen station locations and looked at what are these disadvantaged communities that are actually getting good coverage from that network. And when we took a step back and we looked at the map of this, what we very clearly see is that, yes, a lot of the stations are in or near disadvantaged communities, but they're essentially all in or near the same small set of disadvantaged communities that are really highly localized in kind of the higher population density urban areas like LA and places in certain areas in Orange County. And so you can see on this map on the right, all these red areas are disadvantaged communities that do not have very good coverage from even the 108 or 102 hydrogen stations that are within a 15-minute drive of a disadvantaged community. So our conclusion is that, we're doing a good job when we look at how many of those hydrogen stations are in or near a disadvantaged community, but we're still leaving behind a lot of these communities. So we need to figure out a way to actually get the station network to be more geographically diverse and get it more spread across the state. And we actually find that to be generally the case even for communities other than disadvantaged communities. So finding 5 is about coverage gaps. As I mentioned, coverage is the concept of how many stations do I have, how close to me are they. Our analysis of hydrogen station network coverage gaps reveals opportunities for new station development remains strong in the developed hydrogen fueling markets, so places like LA, San Francisco Bay Area, etc., but also is strong in untapped markets across the state. We do this, so this figure on the right is actually a heat map that shows that analysis. I'm going to come back to this and zoom in on some areas in a moment. But we do this analysis through a geospatial information system tool that we developed at CARB called the California Hydrogen Infrastructure Tool. And what it does is it uses a set of indicators to make an assessment of where the home-based fueling market might be for fuel cell electric vehicles. So where might people live who would adopt this technology. It also looks at commuter traffic, so where might people need to fuel along the way to their work and back. And then it looks at this question of coverage provided by the existing and funded network of hydrogen stations. And it performs a comparison to find the gaps in coverage. Where is it that we have a hydrogen fueling station network coverage that matches the market, or where is it that the market is a lot stronger than our fueling coverage is providing? And we do the same on a similar analysis and comparison in terms of capacity. Now, I showed you earlier a map that showed only the 60 stations that we had open at the time of this report. When we do our analysis, we consider every single station location that we know about. So here on the left is all 110 of the known hydrogen fueling station locations. If you have time to read the report, there's color coding and symbols that show you kind of each station's status and when that station is expected to become open and available for fueling. Our tool then turns that into an actual number turns it into a map, a quantified map across the state that then calculates how good of coverage is there. And then you can see in this map in the middle, anywhere where there's red means there's better coverage. There's more stations at a shorter driving distance away from that location. Blue is kind of the limits of coverage. You know, a station is about 15 minutes away from those locations, and they only have one station available. Shades of yellow are somewhere in between. And so we compare that to that market assessment, and we get to this determination of where are these hotspots, where are these places where the market is stronger than our coverage is providing so far, our planned coverage. So this map on the right, it's the same as the one I showed you a couple of slides ago, the statewide version. It's just with a lot of zoomed in areas. And you can see there's still obviously a lot of opportunity in Los Angeles, around the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly in San Diego. But there is also an opportunity that's equally as strong, and this is new in the last 2 years worth of analysis, in new markets, areas like Fresno, Bakersfield, San Luis Obispo, even Chico and Eureka, some cities and neighborhoods in the Sacramento area like Roseville, down to Modesto, Tracy, Stockton. So we're finding now that we are starting to transition into a regime where we need to continue to make sure that we're providing the capacity and growing coverage in these markets where we started the network and started the market for fuel cell vehicles. But these other areas, these other neighborhoods and markets are becoming just as important to make sure that we can meet the needs of the potential fuel cell buyers. In addition, getting to these other areas helps make sure that the network is continuing to expand and becomes more and more convenient for the drivers who do have those vehicles. It makes more locations easier to get to, even if the drivers live, say, in San Francisco, right? And so I promised I would mention the new funding opportunity, and I do want to make sure that we spend a couple slides on this. A new hydrogen fueling station grant solicitation was launched last Friday. It's called GFO 22607 by the Energy Commission with $27 million available. That's the funds that were made available from the 2021 budget. And there are two pathways for eligibility for a station in this solicitation. One of the goals of this solicitation is to support multi-use hydrogen fueling stations. So any site that is either itself or adjacent to a property with a fleet of fuel cell vehicles, they can be light duty, medium duty, or heavy duty, that will be fueled by the proposed station, is an eligible site. The site does still have to fuel light duty vehicles, but the fleet that it's supporting can be any other, can be any classification. Or if it's not supporting a fleet, if it's not a multi-use station, it's just for light duty, this solicitation explicitly tries to get the station developers to consider and to start building stations in these new areas that we've talked about. So either the area has to be a new market for station development outside of the markets, the urban areas where we've been developing stations the most so far, or it needs to be one of the high need disadvantaged communities that we had looked at on a previous slide. And as you know, of course, some of those high need disadvantaged communities are in those urban areas. So it's kind of backfilling in a little bit of eligibility in those urban areas like Los Angeles, but it's making sure that if we're making those investments in those areas, that it's going towards the purpose of either increasing disadvantaged community access or getting to new markets across the state. I do want to emphasize that these eligibility requirements are only for this particular solicitation, only for these $27 million, and that there's still 66 stations from the prior solicitation, again, that can be proposed to be built anywhere in the state or nearly anywhere in the state within that solicitation's eligibility requirements, which was essentially anywhere that there's anywhere that there is a gasoline station, pretty much. There is a online eligibility map viewer available. There will be a link at my final slide for those of you who are interested. I would encourage anybody with questions about the solicitation to reach out to the Energy Commission first. They are running the solicitation, but for people who have questions about this eligibility map viewer itself, they can reach out to me. And finally, one other note on funding. In addition to the 2021 budget allocation, the 2022 budget actually provided further funds for investment into hydrogen fueling stations. So that added $60 million of additional funds, which the Energy Commission has shown in its latest investment plan update for the Clean Transportation Program to be planned for fiscal years 23, 24, and 25. So over the next 3 fiscal years, $20 million each will go towards hydrogen fueling station infrastructure. The details of the solicitations are not available yet. At this point, it's just planning what are the buckets for the funds. But in effect, this kind of this budget allocation from the 2022 budget does, in a way, sort of extend AB8's funding availability a further 3 years without extending AB8 itself. So our next finding is with respect to the fuel cell electric vehicles population. So every year we analyze the vehicles on the road and look at projections for vehicles into the future. We look at DMV registration data for the numbers of vehicles on the road. And so as of April of 2022, we had just over 11,000 vehicles with active registrations on the road. It's a little bit less than the 13,000 or so that the industry reports as being cumulative sales to that point. However, the cumulative sales data don't always reflect vehicles that have left the in-state fleet, either due to accidents or being taken out of state, etc. There's also always a difference in timing of collection of data as well. So there will always be some slight difference between DMV registration data and cumulative sales data. We do note, however, that the first quarter of 2022 was one of the best-selling quarters so far, and 2021 was the best-selling year, beating the previous best-selling year of 2018 by 40%. So we do see some acceleration in the past year in fuel cell vehicle sales. Now, for future projections, we annually distribute a survey to auto manufacturers, and we ask them for their projections for fuel cell vehicles in 2 time periods. The first period is the mandatory period, which is the following 3 model years. And the second period beyond that is the optional period, which is the next 3 model years after that. So mandatory period is for this year's survey, ran through model year 2025. The optional period ran through model year 2028. We then aggregate all the auto manufacturers' projections for the vehicles, and we do perform some slight analysis, some adjustments to account for differences between model year and calendar year. And then we also utilize this data and spatially disaggregate it to do our market assessment. Based on the information that we received from our survey this year, the projections are 34,500 fuel cell vehicles on the road in 2025 and 65,600 on the road in 2028. Now, of course, as you can see, the projections typically are a bit higher than what we actually get in registration data, but that typically does come down to, or does reflect, differences in the projected station development timeline versus what actually happens at the end of the day as well. So we have shown in prior reports that there is a connection between station development time, fuel cell vehicle projections, and then the difference between fuel cell vehicle projections and what actually gets on the road. So all of these differences are typically easily explained, but we do, of course, note the trends that the projections tend to be a little bit higher than the actual registration data. As far as where all these fuel cell vehicles are, it's actually very interesting to note that the vehicles do tend to be registered near the open and planned hydrogen fueling network, but there are many exceptions. So you can see from this map, the lighter shaded areas are all the zip codes where there's at least one fuel cell electric vehicle registered. And you can see that if you kind of mentally think back to our very first slide and where the stations are, and they're just really located in LA, around the San Francisco Bay Area, Orange County, one in San Diego, a few in Sacramento, you can see that there are definitely some people who are driving distances, pretty far distances, to own and operate and fuel their vehicles. So we do see that there's actually a pretty good spread of the vehicles across the state. 49% of the state's zip codes actually have at least one active fuel cell vehicle registration today. Our seventh finding does a comparison between the station availability, so what we project for the future stations and how many vehicles they could support, versus the hydrogen demand based on the vehicle projections that the auto manufacturers supply. So auto manufacturer survey responses show network daily fueling capacity will lead fuel cell vehicle sales by a significant margin through 2028. So this is something that has evolved in the past couple of years. In almost all of our other annual evaluations, fuel cell vehicle projections in the furthest out years actually outpaced the planned growth of the hydrogen fueling network. And so there was an easy continual need to grow the network. We are now seeing with the Energy Commission's funding of GFO 19602, which was the last solicitation that gave the multi-year funding. And now that we know we have up to 176 stations or more funded in the pipeline already and know their capacities, we know that our plans and our projections for hydrogen fueling, for the hydrogen fueling station network, will far outpace the planned fuel cell vehicle deployment. And that's up to 3.7 times difference. So we could almost quadruple the number of vehicles on the road planned for it to be on the road in 2028 with the network that we have planned now. And that's not even accounting for the extra stations that will come from the new solicitation and the extra stations that will come from the $60 million that were just allocated. So there's room to grow here on the fuel cell vehicle side. Of course, how much room that actually ends up being depends on the schedule and the pacing of the hydrogen station network developing. Again, as we've seen things tend to take longer than projected, but there's still a large scale of room to grow for the projected fuel cell vehicle deployment in the future. Now, that analysis does assume that all the stations are up and running 100% of the time, that 100% of their built nameplate capacity is available. However, we do know that at times that's not the case, especially in recent years. We've had some outages of service, either due to mechanical difficulties or due to availability of hydrogen for the hydrogen fueling stations for parts of the network. However, recent actions by hydrogen providers and station operators have resulted in improved station availability and uptime over the past 6 months. And we can see that we got to one point where in one quarter, there was a week where we had only 31% of the stations available. Actually, that's station days. So like the total time of the state that the stations could be up was only 31%. We've recently gotten back to near pre-COVID, or to our highs that were kind of actually at the beginning of COVID, where we were max availabilities up in the 95% range, but our average was around 79. So our latest data from Q2 of 2022 was our max availability was 84%, and the quarterly average was 75%. So our quarterly average is definitely getting back up there. Our minimum is actually getting better. We can maybe continue to do some improvement on getting to our max availability improvements as well as we go forward. However, we do anticipate this is going to be a continuing trend, and probably if we look at more recent data, the availability has likely continued to increase, just knowing the nature of the improvements that the station developers and the hydrogen fuel providers have made over the last few quarters. And our last finding has to do with renewable hydrogen. So updated data and analysis continue to show that renewable assets contribute to hydrogen production at a higher rate than SB 1505 and incentive program requirements. SB 1505 requires that all hydrogen sold as a transportation fuel in California must be at least 1/3 renewable content. Our incentive programs, both the Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program and the grant solicitations run by the Energy Commission, now have a higher requirement of at least 40% renewable hydrogen. Now, last year we did report that based on station developers' data that have been submitted to the LCFS program, the California's hydrogen fueling network was running above 90% renewable. That has dropped in the past year. That has dropped to more like 59 to 65% renewable over the past year, likely due to some changes in sourcing that we know about because of changes made to enhance reliability, as well as changes in what's available through the energy markets. We did reach out to some station providers, and they did while not confirming the actual number, they did confirm that it is reasonable to assume that some of that high renewable content did fall over the past year based on what they've seen in their own data analysis. So, even though it has fallen, it is still well above 33%, well above 40%, and we anticipate to continue to see stations, of course, be above the 33% requirement because all our funding now requires higher than that, but that stations will continue to maximize renewable content as much as they can going into the future. And so we had a brief set of conclusions and recommendations based on all those findings and the other analyses I presented. First was to work to accelerate station development timelines because the timing has always been the biggest unknown in all of this effort. Fortunately, we did have a bill passed this year, Senate Bill 1291, that actually applies expedited permitting to hydrogen fueling stations. So this is something that charging stations have enjoyed for a couple years, and perhaps will be able to make a difference in hydrogen station development timelines going forward. We recommended that there's a need to emphasize development of hydrogen fueling stations in new markets, and we saw that the new solicitation, GFO 22607, directly incorporates that recommendation. We also recommended that the Energy Commission work to ensure new market development also addresses disadvantaged communities, which again, GFO 22607 directly incorporates. We encouraged auto manufacturers to embrace a more expansive vision of fuel cell vehicles in California. We note that the recently passed Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation establishes a high ZEV future trajectory, which should support that opportunity for growth that in fuel cell vehicle deployment that we mentioned a few slides back. And then finally, we need to continue emphasizing clean hydrogen production and distribution. For those who may not be aware, the federal government has announced $8 billion in available funding for hydrogen hubs across the nation. And California's planned proposal for that does absolutely emphasize clean hydrogen production and distribution for transportation and other uses. So we do see that all of these conclusions and recommendations really are kind of coming to light after this report. And so leave it open now to questions to try and answer. And I'll leave it with a couple of links and my contact information on this page.
And thank you so much, Andrew. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, the questions have been rolling in, and to try to get to as many questions as possible, I'll just start going down the list, and I'll hold my own questions. But one of the questions was related to the growth curve that we saw, and you had indicated, it kind of plateaus in 2026. Can you explain why the growth curve stops in 2026? And the person who asked the question put in bold, we need more stations.
Okay, so you're talking about the stations. So let me try and go back to it. So this figure, oh my goodness, I need to stop pressing because it's I'm out of sync.
Yeah,
Okay,
no
so here's one of
worries.
the figures. Here's one of the ones that shows stations only through 2026. So this is because these are all the stations that we knew about at the time that we wrote this report. So 176 stations is the full universe of all known stations funded through co-funding grant solicitations from the state, through the low carbon fuel standard program, and through announcements made for fully privately funded stations that we have enough information to know like what is coming from that. I will mention that there have been some entities that have made statements so that they want to open hydrogen stations, but we do not have any information that we could verify about those claims to include in this analysis. So 176 stations in 2026 in this plateau, that's only because we don't have any other data beyond 2026. This is the projected schedule based on what the funded station developers have told us in their latest communications. Now, as I mentioned, the general funds are going to add hopefully enough stations, or the idea is to get in more than enough stations to get to the 200 target funded. Although we, of course, at this time, we don't know what that schedule is for when those stations will be built. And then we have another further $60 million that is essentially earmarked for hydrogen fueling stations, even beyond this new solicitation. So we do think that we, of course, think there will be additional stations beyond 176. We just don't have any information right now about them because those funds have not found a home yet. Once the solicitations are out and funded, then we'll be able to include them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that you mentioned the new solicitations on the road, and I also know that you do another report. We refer to it as a self-sufficiency report, and in that report, I think you can correct me where I'm quoting it wrongly, but I think you indicated that an additional somewhere around $300 million of state investment will light off what you call self-sufficiency, which I interpret that as when private funds start flowing into the state, and private stations start building stations without these state or governmental subsidies. Is that right?
So an additional 300 million would get in most of the scenarios that we analyzed in that report would get the network as a whole to self-sufficiency. That means that all of the network doesn't need any more funds and public funds in terms of grants. Of course, low carbon fuel standard program would still be in effect for under those scenarios, but along the way, actually, private money is still going towards the development. Individual stations could be fully privately funded, and just the total amount that goes into the funding of the network transitions away from being more heavily publicly funded to eventually being fully privately funded. So self-sufficiency is just kind of like when all of it finally is privately funded.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Great. Thank you for sharing. I think that you answered this question, but the question is regarding fueling stations in the far north of the state to support I-5 build out as a hydrogen highway. Do you see that this latest CEC funding opportunity that you mentioned, do you think that that will encourage development in those kind of, connector destination stations that we refer to those in the industry?
It certainly has the possibility to. I am actually realizing I don't have a full statewide map for eligibility for that solicitation, but you will, if you take a look at this map viewer, which there's the link at the end of the report or at the end of the presentation. If you go to that map viewer, you will definitely see that those areas are included. And so part of the thinking is that if with this new solicitation, if some of the more, I guess the shinier, LA areas are taken out, then the station developers will find more reason to go to some of these places like that were mentioned by the question being asked. So yes, absolutely, there's the opportunity. It does, of course, come down to the station developers making the decision to go to those areas and being able to find a viable site host as well.
Great, thank you. So then just to kind of round out the questions about, station development and And let's see. Let me just read this question to you. There are projected 79 open stations in 2022 versus 62, and we are at the end of October. I'm concerned for fuel cell vehicle drivers in San Diego still depending on a single station. Is high step availability a roadblock? Is permitting the roadblock? You know, what's slowing down station development?
To date, high step availability has not been the roadblock. You know, as we are getting to more of these stations from the new solicitation becoming available, we do know that there's going to be more strain on the high step program, but we have been planning for it. We do, of course, we are working on actually getting a second high step device available to the state to be able to have both of the devices going around doing testing, but that is probably still going to be a couple years off before that device is ready in the state. Still, we've been discussing ways to resolve, to make sure that high step is not going to be the limiting factor in opening stations. That would be pretty much counter to the whole point of high step. You know, to date, it really has been a variety of things. In some cases, the site owner has backed out, or the site owner has had other projects that go on at the gas station where the hydrogen fueling station is going to be, that then delay the hydrogen station being able to be constructed. Other times it's been permitting, all kinds of different, you can imagine all kinds of different scenarios. Sometimes the permitting agency is just slow. Sometimes the permitting agency is resistant. Sometimes local neighborhood, the neighborhoods might be resistant. All kinds of different issues have popped up in that phase. And then even especially during COVID, and we're still reportedly seeing some of it linger on, there have been some supply chain issues at times. So getting equipment, or getting even being able to get hydrogen to the site to be able to do the testing, or to be able to just do the station commissioning even before things like high step testing occur. And I have also heard, of course, there have been some delays due to what's called site energizing. So the local utility coming out and connecting all the hydrogen equipment to the local electric grid. That has also sometimes been an issue. There is no one single thing, and you can't predict it based on the location. There's been different things happening in different locations, and even within the same jurisdiction. So it's been every station's been its own journey.
And there are activities within the partnership sphere. I would call out GoBiz, or call on GoBiz,
Yep.
and they are trying to accelerate the permitting process. We're trying to up our game in terms of getting out to permitting officials so that we educate them ahead of stations going to them, to just speed the permitting process. Looking at the high step schedule, I'm looking at San Diego Mission Center. I know that that's a much anticipated station. It looks like it's about the fourth or fifth station in the queue in terms of stations that'll be ready for testing.
Yeah.
Or for commissioning, I should say. There are a lot of questions around station performance, I'm gonna jump in and just address the Sacramento area. I know that has been a problematic area. The question is, why is this? We have 3 stations that honestly, we anticipate that the Sacramento area will be oversubscribed for some time until we get those. There are 2 additional stations that are currently being developed in the area. Until we get those stations online, we anticipate that there will be challenges, because the Sacramento area stations are some of the older ones in the network, and so on the operation and maintenance side, it's been challenging to keep them online, especially given the amount of demand in the area. So we are very much looking forward to getting new capacity in the area. Do you have any observations on that, Andrew?
No, I don't think I have much to add. I mean, I do know that it's been difficult. I know that Sacramento was also one of the areas hit by the hydrogen shortage a year or so ago, but that has hopefully improved recently. But yes, reliability of station equipment is, as I mentioned, is sometimes what brings down station availability quite a bit. And so, you know, the station operators are working to try to address that, you know, with their different technologies at each of these different stations. But yes, we do have 2 additional stations under development in the Sacramento area. Hopefully we'll provide alleviate some of that stress. But yeah, we have to wait to see what their result is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of just maybe this is the last station on station performance. I know that this is outside the boundaries of your study, but the question is, what's the plan to address the problem of multiple pump stations having only 1 or 2 pumps available or operational at a time? I mean, maybe I can start off by just by saying that the technology is evolving. We are moving from single dispenser stations to multiple dispenser stations. I think right now the gold standard is stations that have 4 dispensing points. As I understand, at simultaneously, 3 pumps are available at any given time, and then there are issues of you know, some dispensers not being available. I think that this is early market growing pains. If we look at, you know, the evolution of electricity back in the early days of electricity at, you know, the end of the 19th century, they also had issues of availability. I think we're going through that same developmental step in the hydrogen economy. But Andrew, do you have any other observations on that?
Yeah, I mean, I know that's, you know, some developers have put in quite a bit of effort into this. I know, for example, First Element has developed I believe what they call an innovation center or something like that, in Livermore, where they're actually going through and assessing the equipment that's provided to them by their equipment providers and trying to find engineer solutions for some of the problems related to maintenance or longevity of equipment. I think you're right. There's some amount of this that is the learning curve with new technology, new equipment. You know, these station developers are working with brand new, like, you know, the first SKUs, the first you know, pieces of these equipment that have been made, you know, in the world almost, right? So there's some learning that's expected. But, you know, as time goes on, you know, these developers, we have seen evidence that they are putting in effort to try to make the future pieces of equipment, you know, more reliable and more able to withstand these high demand situations. So,
yeah, perfect. I know we're at the hour. I don't want to end this call without addressing the price of hydrogen. There's several questions coming in regarding the price of hydrogen. I know that many of the fuel cell electric vehicle drivers have seen the price of hydrogen go up in the past few months. Can you address that?
Yeah, so the price of hydrogen is, of course, set by the station operators themselves. I do believe it's probably more a question for them to respond to, or to respond through you, Dave.
Sure. I'll be happy to. No, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, and I just really wanted to raise that topic. And yeah, no, the price of hydrogen is an issue. We have seen the price of hydrogen increase. A number of our station developers have posted statements and will be posting statements on their station pages and then publicly. There are several factors affecting the price of hydrogen. You know, starting with, you know, the state of the economy and overall inflation, but then you know, society-wide, we've seen the supply disruption that was a major result of COVID has had an impact on the availability of parts and the cost of goods. And so the cost of just the parts for the station have gone up. We've seen across the value chain an increase in the cost of doing business. But then what we also see is that the station developers rely in large part on LCFS credits. That's a low carbon fuel standard program that Andrew mentioned earlier. We've seen that credit price drop. It was hovering around $200 a credit, and it has dropped fairly dramatically. It's hovering anywhere between $70 and $90 a credit today. And that was factored in by the station developers when they priced hydrogen. But that depression in the price means that there's less value that they're getting per credit, and in order to stay solvent, they needed to increase their prices. The reason for the depression of the credit is we've seen, in large part, it's due to renewable diesel coming into the marketplace. Renewable diesel being a low carbon fuel. And the volume of renewable diesel entering the market and being taken up by the market has had an impact, a fairly large impact on the value of an LCFS credit.
So one thing I will say or add to that is that, even though there have been these recent price increases, overall our expectation is still, the broader trend, or the longer term trend, is that hydrogen fuel prices should be decreasing over time, especially this decade. There are a number of efforts, especially at the federal level, like the hydrogen hubs that I mentioned. The Inflation Reduction Act has several provisions for hydrogen. So we expect that there's a lot of support structure at the state and federal level, that over time, even if there is this increase in price right now, that this should be something that is not permanent, and that over time that we still expect that we should be seeing prices come down as hydrogen becomes a bigger part of the overall energy picture, and as technologies are developed to get hydrogen produced at lower and lower costs, and delivered at lower and lower costs. So we still see that is the more likely trend over time, and that these recent hydrogen prices are not the overall long-term trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I'd like to close on that. Just the question came in regarding, and I realize we're over time, so this will be the last question. But the question is, with regard to hydrogen hubs, what's the outlook of California being selected as a national hydrogen hub, and what impact this will have on the growth of the hydrogen industry as a whole, and the state of hydrogen fueling network?
So I hope the outlook is good. I personally can't say. I'm not the federal government running that will be running the funding program. However, yeah, I mean, part of what we hope is California's strength is the commitment that we already have through several of our state programs towards hydrogen development. The kind of leg up we have in terms of the momentum and the development that we already have in the market. Of course, most of our work so far has been in light duty transportation. We're starting to get a lot more going in medium and heavy duty transportation, but our application is likely to focus to include other applications like industry or power, the power sector, etc. I think I think we stand to have a lot of good opportunity. Perhaps it's California's to lose, but I can't say anything for sure when it comes to
absolutely.
an application.
I think you nail it on the head. I think it is for California to lose. I guess some of the factors around this or indicators. Obviously we cannot predict whether the federal government will choose what hubs they will choose. All we know is that it says they will choose a minimum of 4 hubs in the statutory language. The one indicator is California is the only state that's called out singly as a hydrogen, as a potential hydrogen hub, in the statutory language. So that right there is a good indicator. Secondly, is California has the only hydrogen economy in the country and one of the few in the world. So another good indicator that we would serve well as a hub. I would say that in terms of the impact on growth, if California were to be chosen as a hub, it will I imagine that it will accelerate everything. The growth of the network, the growth of production, the growth of distribution. This is a topic among our members very actively. Where are the choke points in the supply chain, and how do we make the supply chain more resilient? And that's for instance, midstream delivery was a big conversation on a DOE call the other day. And do you have enough liquefaction capacity to deliver liquid hydrogen to the fueling stations? And certainly, yeah, I think we could use a lot more investment in that space, and that would certainly make the supply chain much more resilient. And then, we have the emergence of vehicles, and we have many tier one truck and engine manufacturers, entering the market, which is a huge sign that this is, just the start of the marketplace. And, hopefully the indication is that there are other automotive manufacturers looking to enter the market. They're just waiting for the right opportunity or right moment to step in.
Yeah, I think I would agree that probably, if I had to bet, the big impact will probably be on the production and distribution of hydrogen, and importantly of clean hydrogen, so that will essentially make that aspect of that portion of operating costs that much easier to absorb for pretty much all applications, right? So for light duty, medium, heavy duty, or even stationary applications of hydrogen. So that's kind of where I think a lot of the power possibly lies in the hydrogen hubs opportunity. Awesome.
Well, Andrew, I very much appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. And as you can see on screen, Andrew has provided his email address if you'd like to reach out directly. My email address is dpark, that's dpark at H2FCP. That stands for Hydrogen Fuel Cell Partnership.org. So dpark at H2FCP.org. And thank you. If we did not get your question, please feel free to reach out. We'll try to reach back out to you if possible. And we appreciate your time. So thanks very much for attending, everybody.